We're recording.
Okay. Hi, everybody. This is SIG Auth for May 30th, 2018. Today, we have a demo, a few pulls of note, and then an overall discussion about sort of the review bottleneck. So I'm just going to go ahead and dive into the demo that we put on here. Leading us. So I've been working on a little sort of utility is called kubeOIDC that I would like to go show off to everybody today. It's just a set of tools that I think can help people try to use OIDC, which is a pretty common way for us to describe to people who are trying to bootstrap their clusters into using authentication to actually have some amount of single sign-on rather than having everybody pass around root credentials to the boxes, which is surprisingly common. So just to remind everybody how OpenID Connect works in Kubernetes, OpenID Connect produces JWTs that can be validated against a particular provider. In this case, I'll show a little demo in a second that'll use Google. So Google gives you an OpenID Connect JWT and then has a bunch of keys that allow you to validate that JWT. One second, I'm going to mute someone because they are very loud. Thank you. So the way that Kubernetes validates JWTs, it doesn't actually have any way of initializing a login flow for JWTs. You generally just do all of the API server only validates JWTs. It doesn't prescribe how you are going to get them, how you're going to get these things called ID tokens, and how you're eventually going to use them. So this is sort of a pretty big barrier to entry for a lot of administrators trying to set up OpenID Connect. Generally, what we can go tell them is use something like the Tectonic console, which knows how to initialize these flows to do that, but there's no really good open source solutions. So one of the simple things that kubeOIDC provides is a little login service. To demonstrate how this works, I'm gonna go to localhost 8080 where my service is running. I've given it an ID token, so it immediately, or I've given a OAuth credentials to Google. It bounces me around. I log in with my Red Hat account, and I've successfully logged in. This is all the information and the claims that it's parsed out of the token. So it can show my email, and Kubernetes can now use this information to grab this. And then there's just a simple download. So I go ahead and download a kubeconfig. Cool. So now over here, if I use that kubeconfig, system, this now works as me. And if I do something like get nodes, you'll see that the error actually shows that I am not authenticated. I'm authenticated as me. I'm not authenticated as something else, or as another provider or an admin user. So it's actually granting me an ID token, doing a simple little generation of kubeconfig, and talking to people who've been trying to use OIDC. I think that this will be helpful for them just to understand, like, oh, have your users go here, log in, and then download a kubeconfig, and they can start going. If you actually look at this kubeconfig, it's right now pointed at localhost. So this isn't actually pointed at a real cluster, even though this cluster is running on AWS that it's talking to. And this gets into the second part of my demo and the second utility in the kubeOIDC repo, which is something that I call kubeOIDC proxy. So right now we have a proxy that's running on localhost 9443. And I'm still using my ID token to access this localhost proxy. But it turns out that my Kubernetes cluster right now is not configured to understand OpenID Connect. It's just a regular Kubernetes cluster. I haven't reconfigured any of the flags. And in another terminal, I have my login service running on my port 8080 where I logged in, and then a proxy. So the proxy is just an authenticating proxy that is understanding ID tokens. It actually uses sort of the same logic that Kubernetes internal API server uses to authenticate the ID tokens. It authenticates the ID tokens and then uses impersonation headers on the back end to talk to the API server. So that means that I logged in using my OpenID Connect token. It authenticated me, used impersonation headers. And the nice part about this is that I'm not actually using, I do not have to configure my API server at all to understand OpenID Connect. This has been really problematic, I think, for some providers who build services on top of Kubernetes. Some of the hard rules for the people that we've talked to, is that this has to be able to install on any Kubernetes cluster, no matter what the API server flags are enabled or not enabled. And I think that this is a fun little way of demonstrating that with an authentication proxy, you could do something like, all of a sudden, I can build a Helm chart that works on top of any cluster and have a console that uses OpenID Connect to authenticate users. It doesn't rely on any of the underlying, it doesn't make any assumptions about what type of protocols the API server is configured to use. So that's just it's a pretty quick demo, but that's about it. The repo that I'm working on just has a few tools that hopefully help people get started with these type of things and get to the point where you can tell your users to just go and download kubeconfigs from here. And then later on, other stuff might get added or docs might get linked. But that's about it. And if anybody has any questions, let me know.
Did the kubeconfig it generated, was that one that could like renew its ID token, or does that just inline the token? I forgot to look.
It just inlines the token for now. You could go use refresh, but it seems simpler to not.
Sure, I was just curious.
Yeah. Awesome. So now onto pulls of note. The first one is another item of mine, promoting the exec plugin support to beta. So this PR was opened yesterday. I didn't realize that I was cutting it really, really close with code freeze, but this is not a very large PR in terms of it doesn't change much functionality. It's just doing all of the things so we can get a V1 beta little tag in there. I don't know if this gets merged now or gets merged once code freeze is over. And we should probably discuss that with various people. And if anybody here has thoughts, that'd be great to hear. But the biggest thing is that it doesn't change much of the functionality. So hopefully alpha will continue to work and then have a sort of seamless transition into beta.
I know the TLS PR is kind of in the last stages of review, and that adds 2 fields to the response object. So that would intersect with this. I think this is basically promoting the existing response API as is and dropping the input API because the only thing we were using it for, we didn't actually need. Is that correct? Whether or not the thing was interactive could be detected?
Whether or not the thing was interactive could be detected.
Yeah.
And even then, no one was using the input parameters. So
yeah, I think the only other one that I had remembered talking about was on retry, like indicating to the plugin whether or not they were being contacted in response to a 401 or just kind of greenfield. And the other thing I could think of is if we ever wanted to support negotiation flows, you would need to provide kind of the negotiate headers. But I agree that if we're not using it in its current state, it was kind of wonky enough that doing it in an MVAR like that, probably don't want to promote that to beta without thought.
Yeah, and this actually modifies it. So if you do use alpha, you continue to get the input. So that might be a good way for users who feel the need to read responses from the API server or things like interactive, that they still have an out for a little bit, and then they can give us that feedback so we can put that into any future beta.
I would actually consider taking the distinct parts of information that we want to feed in and making those tokens that they could put in their invocation. So if you want a server response code, then you can pass that as a token, then pass it as an arg to yourself, or a interactive true false or negotiate header. Like, it seems like we're going to have maybe 1 to 3 specific pieces of information, and letting you pass that to yourself as an arg might be cleaner. But I think that can be a follow-up. I'm in favor of promoting this. Be interested to hear what other people think.
One of the things I remember that was brought up was the ability to have it not ever cache the token at all.
So it doesn't cache it today unless you indicate in your response that it should be cached. Is that correct?
It caches it in memory. But yeah, I think there was a request that was basically like, we don't, rather than trying to be thoughtful about whether or not we should cache it, we should have a mode where we can just not cache it. The nice part about that is that that could probably be configuration to this exact plugin, like where you specify the environment variables and the arguments of the command line. I could easily see that being there. And that has nothing to do with sort of our call and response for the inputs and outputs that is part of the API that we're trying to promote to beta.
I guess that depends on if it's a never cache configuration, that might make sense. Yeah, it would probably be helpful to gather kind of the open questions in the description of this, just so we can make sure we get resolution on all of them before we put this in. All right.
Awesome. The next one is the dynamic audit configuration cap. Does someone want to talk about that?
Yeah, hey, I'm Patrick. I'm with Heptio. We are trying to build out some auditing tools, and one of the kind of the first barriers to getting people to adopt that stuff is, the configuration of the audit stuff. So we're looking to try and make that process a little easier. So we built out, we're looking to build out, dynamic audit configuration similar to dynamic admission control, but also allow the policies to be dynamic as well. So hoping to get working on this the next couple of weeks. I know we have a couple questions as far as how we want to implement some stuff around, if there's a static config live on the master versus, dynamic config in the cluster, what takes precedence, how do we handle that? Do we want to have multiple webhook backends and multiple policies for those backends? And then how does that sync in to what Tim was talking about there? He has a thing open for streaming audit events out of the cluster. How do we kind of sync these two things up going forward? So I think those are some of the open questions left in it that I've seen so far, at least.
Yeah, as someone who wrote something that consumes audit logs, I would love to be able to dynamically turn that on for a subset of requests for a short period of time and then turn it back off. I do think the question about whether the static config is sort of a bedrock that always is outputting and is largely independent of the dynamic ones, or if it is a limiting factor and all the dynamic ones must fit within it. I think Tim and I were on a thread where we were kind of trying to suss out which direction are we trying to go with this. I think the point that we don't want something that compromises a cluster to be able to flip off the auditing that is protecting us and giving us confidence that nothing has compromised our cluster is well taken.
Yeah, I think there's good use cases for from a command line flag or from a sort of provider being able to reduce the scope in both directions. So you don't want even someone who's a cluster admin but maybe less trusted than the provider to disable auditing that you need enabled. We also don't necessarily, may not want them to be able to enable full request logging also for safety reasons. So it seems like you need to be able to sort of put bounds around what's the sandbox for what you can enable, what you can play with dynamically versus what's the kind of bedrock.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there's a good discussion in the PR.
Yeah.
Do we want to limit the dynamic stuff, or do we think we just want them to operate separately? I guess this is kind of one of the core questions.
Yeah, that's kind of the core question. Like, is the dynamic stuff a debug mode thing? Like, you want to increase verbosity around a certain user or around a certain set of requests temporarily beyond what the base config is? Or are these sort of long-running things that are disjoint? You're sending one set of events one place and a different set of events a different place. Yeah, figuring out the use cases and making sure we're not cutting ourselves off at the legs for ones that seem important is good, even if it doesn't all get implemented in the first pass. Just thinking through how we would eventually do it.
Yeah, I know our use cases at least are pretty long running. So it would be kind of a long running configuration. But I could definitely see how you maybe want to limit it from a cluster admin perspective of, hey, we don't want to be logging requests for secrets ever, right? Because it's sensitive data. So I can kind of see it both ways.
Okay. I think continuing the conversation in the PR is good. This next week will probably be pretty busy with people finishing out 111 stuff, but then I'd like to see that pick back up.
Cool.
I just realized my microphone was muted.
You've been talking at us this whole time. Tim's really quiet today.
I think the streaming audit backend is more likely to be useful for a debugging use case, just because the kind of pull-based model is a little easier to plug into. And I suspect that the kind of the webhook push model is more likely to be used in a, have a long running thing. Maybe you're running on a cloud provider that has their own audit logging setup, like GKE, and you want to like push your audit events off to your custom setup.
And so the streaming would almost, like when you open the stream, you would provide something that would essentially transform into a policy that would describe the types of events and requests and users you'd wanted to stream. And it would start tapping into those for your stream, something like that. Because we obviously don't want to accumulate all data on the off chance that someone might start a stream. So it would have to be dynamic.
Yeah, so I was picturing the streaming thing as something like you open it up with basically like a follow, and it's just, you only get new events. There's no history saved there.
Yeah.
Would you also have to open that follow against sort of every API server, potentially, if there were multiple? All right.
So the audit pipeline sort of, is this for the kind of delegated API server model?
Aggregated servers, yeah.
Aggregated, sorry. Yeah, so that in that model, the API requests typically enter through single API server. And so you can audit at that point. But you might not be able to get the full request and response body, but you should be able to get metadata at the kind of the entry point API server.
I like the idea of kind of doing what has worked well for monitoring, and maybe looking at how the pull and push plus the auto discovery might make this a little more scalable.
I think there were also issues around if the goal is to be able to configure the API server to push a webhook to something running on the cluster. Didn't we already have issues with sort of the networking specifics for different configurations with, I think, the self-hosted authorization proposal that is still open.
Yeah, there's issues with like DNS resolution, like the API server won't resolve sort of kubedns like service names. So there are things that are hard. You end up with like running it as a node port or something like that instead.
The advantage of having it dynamic is you can look that up at runtime and then configure it there, which would be handy. So you could potentially look up the cluster IP at runtime and configure the webhook out to that.
Cool. Are we good and think that we can continue discussion on the PR?
Yeah.
Awesome. So somebody requested this PR, the non-root group API changes. Is that person here? I actually didn't catch your name when I resolved your issue. Okay. I don't remember what.
Oh, I have some context on this. I'm happy to talk about it, but I don't know.
I think since we don't have much background, maybe we just keep going.
Sure.
I also wanted to call out the token, service account token projection PR. I'll add a link as well. That is Mike's alpha implementation for requesting a service account token be injected. So the design was merged a few weeks ago, and the PR is finishing up review probably today or tomorrow. So that is getting the API changes in alpha this release, and then he was going to start working on getting the kubelet to be doing that request in 1.12.
Awesome. Mike, do you have any follow-ups there?
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah, so actually that PR has also been out for quite a while and has had a pretty thorough review by Andrew, and I would love to actually get that into 1.11.
Oh, the kubelet one?
Yeah,
Okay.
Have you seen that one?
I think I saw it. I had not gotten to it. Had someone on the storage team taken a look at it as well?
Yes,
Okay.
they have committed to taking a look. I intend to push to get that into 1.11, not just API changes.
Okay.
And the other thing that I would also like to get into 1.11 is the token review changes. I think we settled on behavior of that token review. And if it's a lower priority than the getting the implementation of the token volume source for me, but I would also like to see that land. That was the change that plumbed that context all through with audience. I think you were on that PR as well.
Yeah. Let me add these to the meeting.
So those are the three things that I would like to see in 1.11. I'll be working to close those out. I think they're all pretty close.
Okay.
I think this segues into our next topic, I guess. The token volume source, the token volume source and API and the token review API, I think you are the only approver for those two sections. So if we can get those APIs settled on and approved, we can start getting other approvers for the implementation. I can get the storage team to work on that. And I've noticed that there's a lot of the owner files in staging, like specifically like the client Go and a lot of the API machinery, they're a little scant. And sometimes people can get busy and unresponsive.
Yeah.
Like Lava Lamp is one of the hardest persons to get a hold of it. But any advice on how to increase the speed that we can get approvals in those staging directories?
So I know Client Go specifically just got kind of cleaned out, reset like this week. It had a ton of people who were actually pretty unresponsive, or in some cases not even on the project anymore. And so you would get assigned to people who aren't looking at PRs.
Yeah.
So I think Client Go specifically, we want to rebuild that with people who are active. So if you want to make suggestions, I think Stefan and Daniel were kind of seeding it with a set of people, but yeah, if we want to put people who are active in there, that's fine. For some of the other, like the auth package, one of the things that I am wanting to do as part of the sub-project stuff is take the tech leads over those areas and make sure that all of them are in there as owners, and then people who are involved in those areas get pulled in as reviewers. So I'm hoping that the sub-project stuff will actually give us more principled ways to kind of put people in those and get more than like 2 people.
More than just random guess or whoever touched the file 3 years ago when we generated.
Yeah.
I think that's good, but I would like to see progress made towards that, because and have we merged the governance PR yet?
So that has an LGTM from the 3 of us, Eric, Tim, and I. I tagged in the steering committee. I need to go chase someone down. I think we're supposed to get an ACK from them before we merge stuff there. So as far as we're concerned, it's ready to go, but just haven't chased someone down.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes sense to align these owners' files with the project.
So the auth and auth-z ones are probably the ones that have the most activity under them. Like the ones around kubelet certificate, like the certificate utilities. I'm not actually aware of stuff that's been really blocked by that, but maybe I'm just missing it. But yeah, there are definitely some, like the Client Go top level one, the auth and auth-z top level ones are
a little slower.
Those are the slower ones.
So then after we get signed off by governance, who is responsible for taking Eric's doc as the prototype and turning that into the official mission and sub-project list for SIG Auth? I assume that will also go in the community repo in the same.
Yeah, it'll go in as a PR, and all the SIGs are basically hitting the managing lots of YAML files of owners manually and trying to keep them in sync pain right now. And as soon as you do anything in the community repo, it's out of date.
Right.
So, yeah, but at least getting a starting point of identifying the people who are maintaining and reviewing and getting their names in the owners files. So,
right.
It'll be Tim or Eric or I will fight each other for it, I'm sure. I think that will probably be after next Tuesday.
Sure, certainly.
But I agree on the approver bandwidth. Things that cross a lot of SIGs and things that touch APIs tend to be the slowest, and we tend to have a lot of those, especially the cross SIG ones. We've hit more API things recently with your token stuff. That's not always, we don't always have API related stuff, but we usually have cross SIG stuff.
Right.
And so owners files on these packages will help for some things, but they're not actually going to help with the thing that touches the kubelet and touches the API and touches the controllers and requires scheduling and Node and whoever else to all be aware. So, but we should do what we can to unblock the subtrees we control. So
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you.
As a short-term fix, I just want to encourage anyone who has PRs assigned to them to try and be really responsive over the next week. As we enter into code freeze, there's probably going to be a lot of things trying to land quickly.
Also, because this is the last week, so Code Slush started yesterday, and Code Freeze is a week from yesterday. It's the 5th. Is that a Tuesday? I think so.
Sorry, when is the code freeze?
Code Freeze is June 5th. Code Slush started yesterday, meaning that only things specifically targeted for 111 are going in now. So there's a week that is built in for us to finish and focus on 111 work exclusively. So if there are things for 111, if you have a pull request that you think is targeting 111 and it doesn't have the V111 milestone on it, please tag one of Tim, Eric, or I to request that that milestone be put on. So the way we are tracking what needs to hit the milestone is things with the SIG Auth label and the V111 milestone. And so just because your PR doesn't have the milestone doesn't mean we don't think it needs to go in. It just means that we didn't have to add the milestone before, and now we do. And so now we will if it is targeting 111. Mike, do you want to put in the kubelet PR for the token request stuff? Link that into the notes. Maybe it's below.
Yeah, sure, I will.
Awesome. Does anyone have any other points of discussion or anything else they want to talk about today?
Yeah, I joined late. I wanted to discuss the comments on my PR, if that's the right time right now.
Which PR is that?
Yeah, this is 62216.
Okay, perfect, yeah. Did you have any specific questions here about the feedback? I know that Tim all
Yeah, I think there was some comments from Tim All Clear and one other person about verifier non-root not being in the right place. I probably don't understand that fully, so I wanted to get some clarity on that. Let's go to the last comment. I think that yeah, this one. Yeah, the Yu Zong. I have several. I echo what Tall Claire mentioned in the previous comment. I think this validation comes later, and volumes may already be mounted with FS group earlier. I don't fully understand this. If someone could help me understand that, what needs to be done here?
I actually think that SIG node would probably be the better place to discuss the implementation details of this. I will say that at a high level, my concern was there's a lot of different kind of paths to adding adding a group to a container.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make sure that this verify run as non-root actually captures all of those. And so I can follow up with Yuju offline and comment on the PR to clarify this specific comment.
Okay, I think, yeah, so I mean, I think I added the FS group check, but the concern is that at whatever point this runs, right, it won't check because at whatever point verify non-root fails, the pod would not be running, right? So wouldn't that still not allow the pod to run as root? Or is that like, are we saying, I mean, are we saying that the mount will still be done even though the pod is not running? That's a risk. And I can take that offline. I just wanted to.
Yeah, I'm not sure on the, I haven't looked at the details of this specific.
Sounds good. Okay. And yeah, one of you can, if someone can mark this as 1.11, that would help.
Okay. And were the Node and the CRI reviews proceeding as well? I know there was some discussion about like if this was only supported in Docker Shim or other CRIs. Has that been proceeding as well for this feature?
Right. So this is gated as alpha, and I will basically open a PR for the CRI validation tests and follow up on that.
Okay.
I guess that is okay, right? That is because this is alpha.
Yeah, it's alpha. It's disabled by default. Staging it out is fine. I just saw the question in the PR,
right.
and I wasn't sure.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Awesome. Any final pulls of notes or discussion points?
Our tests have been really green, which is awesome. I'm getting pinged about CLI and API machinery test flakes, but all tests have been green. So good job, everyone.
Awesome. As you said, auth is probably not somewhere you want a lot of flakes. So
yeah.
Cool. Well, I'll give everybody back 20 minutes. Thanks for your time, and catch you in 2 weeks. And yes, be very diligent about the 111 PRs over the next week.
All right. Thanks.